Let us consider this morning an aspect of God which is awful. Part of the outworkings of the characteristics or the attributes of the very being of God which brings forth fear of Him. Something which is dreadful and horrific in many ways. This is a subject, a topic which is vacant or empty from many sermons and pulpits today. It's a topic which is alien to the modern mind. This fear of God. This is a topic, a subject which the world outside, the skeptics and the worldlings refuse out of hand and say it's barbaric, it's inhuman, it's immoral. Well, it's not surprising they don't believe in God in the first place in their madness. How they don't believe in God, it is beyond my understanding. They smile at you and me for saying, yes, we believe in God, and when we speak about the fear of God, they look down on us as if we are infantile. In fact, one of their great gurus is Sigmund Freud, the great psychoanalysis. And let me come off my subject for a moment. If you've ever encountered a counsellor who's given you counselling, they will have studied Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. And I studied psychology as part of my training at Glasgow University. And I'll tell you right now, psychoanalysis is a quack science and it's dangerous. Yeah. So don't ever go to a counsellor, because what they tell you, what they try and do is give you regression therapy. They want to examine your feelings and your emotions, and they want to go back to your childhood, and it's dangerous, it's mentally disturbing, have nothing to do with them. It's a proven quack science. True psychology is behavioural psychology, the study of behaviour and the attempt to change it through social engineering. And just now, actually, we in this country and in the world, we're going through a process of social engineering, and practical psychology is being applied to us. Now, we may not like it, but that very fact that you're sitting in here this morning with your face masks on is proof that it's happening. And eventually the plan is that we'll get so used to wearing them that we'll keep wearing them and we won't complain about it anymore. I know not everybody will, some people will complain, but it's a process of social engineering that's going on for a purpose, to save the NHS and to save lives. But you can see what's going on. But coming back to Sigmund Freud, this quack scientist from Vienna, he said laughingly about Christians who believe in God and who speak about the fear of God, he said that this religious faith that we Christians have, he called it an infantile illusion, because he just couldn't believe in God. And all these clever skeptics with all their PhDs, with all their education, they think they're wise, but they're not. They're absolutely mad for denying His existence. For the very existence of God is amply demonstrated all around us. And how they can't see that is beyond me. When you speak to them and you say to atheists who don't believe in God, and you say, well, look at this wonderful universe that God has made. Isn't it awesome? Isn't it incredible? It's mind-boggling, and every day it seems that our astronomers are telling us something new about the cosmos, and they're telling us about things that it's baffling to understand. And look at this world we live on, as Kevin was explaining, this wonderful world. There's not a planet like it in the universe. It's full of water, and water is life-sustaining. And this planet of ours is full of life, and there's nowhere else in the universe like it. And our clever scientists and skeptics, they can't make it. They can't even make life. They can't make anything out of nothing. And then when we ask them, well, where did all this come from? They smile at us as if we're children, as if we're infantile. And they say, that's a silly question, you shouldn't ask it. But when you persist and ask them, well, where did it all come from? They say, it came out of nothing, by nothing and by no one. Now, isn't that the definition of madness? So no wonder they reject this concept of the fear of God. They say it's barbaric, it's inhuman. We're modern people, we've come of age, we stand up on our own 2 feet now. We don't need religion to guide us and control us. And we should jettison all this sort of talk of the wrath of God and the fear of him. This is a subject, a topic, which is even alien in many churches today. It's interesting that the majority of people in this country, I think it's over 60%, actually do believe in some sort of God. And I read that in The Guardian, I think it was The Guardian. But they may not call him God, they may give him other names like the Spirit of the universe, but they do believe in something beyond themselves. In fact, we've got a colleague, Belinda and I, and well, we know he's had a bit of a breakdown, but he would talk to Belinda a lot about the Spirit of the universe. And Belinda would laugh at him. You mean God? Oh no, I don't. He doesn't like the name God. But these people, they believe in something. About 60% of the population, but the majority of them cannot cope with the idea of the fear of God. A few years ago, I send my daily text. I send in two parts. I send a text to people on their mobile phone, and those who don't have that, I send by email. And I've got a list of people I send. I do it every day, and I know some of you, like I did, you don't get it. But if you want it, I could do it by Facebook if you haven't got a phone or whatever. But anyway, a few years ago I was doing it, and I mentioned the fear of God, and there was one particular person who was so upset by this concept, so upset that he was angry with it, and he wanted me to stop sending him the text, and he stopped coming to the church because he couldn't cope the idea of the fear of God. We have bishops and archbishops, we've got pastors and ministers and preachers who say God is love. And they say if that's the case, and it is, they say, then there's no room, there's no scope at all for this idea of the wrath of God and to fear him. It's an old-fashioned idea. It's like the dinosaurs. It's dead and gone. We don't want it in our churches anymore because it produces extremists in their religion. And what it is what's going on in our churches today. There are two gospels being preached. There's the first gospel, the false gospel, and it's based on the idea that they believe the universe and this world and your life and my life is being built around one purpose, and that purpose is for the betterment of humanity. That's what they believe. They talk about this thing, the great harmony of all things, the betterment of humanity for human happiness. And that being so, we must abandon this idea of the wrath of God and the fear of God. And that's what's being preached in churches today. But then there's a true gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which says that God made everything for one purpose, and that purpose was for him, not for us. And that's why they reject this concept. So this morning, let us consider this concept of the fear of God. And first of all, let us consider where it comes from, why we have it. And then let us consider the benefits of it. First of all, this fear of God, where does it come from? Well, let me start by saying this. The majority of people out there in the world, even though 60% of the population believe in something, someone higher than themselves, they spend hardly any time contemplating him. And if you want to know God, if you want to know him, you must begin, as our text says, by obeying his commandments. And to come to know God, you've got to do what Anne's doing now. You've got to be picking up the scriptures and reading it. For all that there is to know about God, the vast majority of it is found in the scriptures. The only other thing we can know about God by looking at the world around us is his eternal power and his Godhead, as the scriptures tell us. We need to take time in our lives and pause and contemplate God and read the scriptures. Now in this day and age, people are busy. We're busy all the time. Belinda's got me up at the crack of dawn and she's got work for me. I'm up doing the dishes, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm only teasing. But we lead busy lives. And like Anne was saying, I found the same thing, Anne. I'm busy and I forget to read the scripture, and I chide myself, and sometimes Belinda said, we've not read the scriptures yet, and so in the evening we'll read them, but I try, and Belinda does the same, we try and read the scriptures in the morning. But We spend our lives busy doing things for ourselves. We're busy, busy, busy. And yet, just to give God just 20 minutes, half an hour of our time is proving difficult to do. If you read just 4 chapters of the Bible every day in a year, you'll have read the Bible all the way through. Just 4 chapters, 20 minutes. Then spend just another 10 minutes. Just relax and stop doing what you're doing. Stop being busy about trying to gather the things of this life. Just spend 10 minutes with God in prayer. And don't say anything, really. Don't ask Him for anything. Just spend half that time, 5 minutes, just contemplating Him. And then something will happen to you. Have you ever been away on your own, contemplating God? Have you ever been to the cliff tops on your own and just spent time alone with Him? Or have you ever been up some mountain, some hill? Well, before I was married, I used to go every day into the hills where I came from in Scotland. And I'd spend time alone with God. And I knew Him. And like John, I sensed Him with me. It was something real and dynamic. Reminds me of the story of Stuart Kennedy. This was just before, a few years before the First World War. Stuart Kennedy became famous as the great poet preacher in the Church of England. He was given a nickname called Holy Willie. No, sorry, I forgot his name. Woodbine Willie. But Stuart Kennedy, he lived down in the southeast of England, near the coast. This day, he hadn't really spent much time thinking about God, but this particular evening, he decided to do that. For the first time in his life, he decided to spend time just contemplating God and looking at the world He had made. And he walked down this lane he had walked down many times before. There were no street lights. There was only the light of the moon, and it wasn't a full moon, and just the stars. He knew where he was going. He was going to a cliff top. And he could hear the waves down below. He couldn't see them, but he heard them, and he heard them breaking on the rocks. And he was all alone, and he was contemplating the divine. When all of a sudden, a sensation came over him. It wasn't something he felt deep down inside. It was something came about him. And he stopped in his tracks, and he felt terrified. He knew he wasn't alone. And he cried out, "Who goes there?" Later on, during the First World War, when he was an army chaplain in the trenches, he disobeyed orders. At night time, he used to crawl out over the trenches into no man's land, and he would try and find wounded men, British and German, and he'd bring them back so the doctors could work on them. This particular night, he got caught, and he got lost because of the bombardment started, and he got lost. He couldn't remember his way back to his own lines. Everything then went quiet, and he lay there, and he knew he was in a dangerous position because snipers were now ready, and he could hear them shooting. And he was praying, and he was praying, then all of a sudden, he felt all alone, then all of a sudden he felt he wasn't. Then he cried out again, "Who goes there?" And he knew the answer. It was God. And he brought back the wounded with him. Let me ask you, have you had that experience? Have you stopped your busy life, paused what you're doing, and spent time just contemplating Him? And have you sensed His presence around you? For when you do, something comes upon you, and that something is the fear of God. It makes you feel humble. We're nobodies. We're insignificant. And He is the great God Almighty. To have the fear of God, you must pause in your life. And you must contemplate Him. Now the thing is this, every human being will one day experience the fear of God. If not in this life, then in the next. On that last day of judgment. And as the very last verse in our text says, in our chapter says, on that great day of assizes, those who don't fear God now On that day their knees will quake with terror, and they'll have to answer for everything they've said and done, all their thoughts and all their inactions, and they'll have to pay the price for their own sins, and they'll know that all eternity will be spent lost. And for us who have experienced this fear of God, who know Him in this life, on that terrible day we'll stand there and the living God will declare us righteous, justified, and we'll enter into His presence and we'll live and reign there with Him forever. In 1930 in Australia, in Sydney, there was an evangelist preacher, and he was having a campaign, and he was preaching in a great hall there over a number of nights in the week. And great audiences used to come, great congregations. It wasn't that. That wasn't those the days. We don't get that anymore. When Billy Graham was preaching with thousands. But anyway, this preacher's preaching, and he's going through the gospel message during the week. Coming along every night was this drunkard, this alcoholic. He was basically illiterate. His name was Arthur Slate. And he came along, and the Lord was working on his life. And he began to experience God, and the fear of God came upon him. On the very last night, the preacher said, if you don't fear God in this life, you will on that last and great and terrible day. And the one word that we need to pass to everybody, the preacher said, is eternity. We need to get people to pause and think about eternity. Where will you spend your eternity? Will it be lost? Or will you be with the Lord forever? Now, Arthur Slate got converted. He was an uneducated man, a real alcoholic, but he felt compelled by God to do something. And what it was is every single day for the rest of his life, and he died in 1967, he got up at 5:30 in the morning and he had chalk. Now, he could hardly scribble his name. But eventually, what he started to do was to write in big letters on the pavements in Sydney the one word, eternity. Gradually, his writing became beautiful. People used to flock round and ask him, why are you writing that? And then John, he would share the gospel with them. Wonderful. It is right, it's eternity. We've got to pause and think about. Either we're going to fear God now in this life, or we're going to be terrified forever. Now let's consider the aspect of God's character as being that produces this fear of God for those who come to know Him. And it's this. There is the terror of losing your salvation, or the terror of being damned forever. But then there is the fear of God itself. And first of all, it comes from the quality of God, which we call His glorious majesty. In this day and age, in our age where we think about equality and democracy, the idea of majesty has been diluted. Many people in this country today have no time for Her Majesty the Queen. Most of us have never met the Queen. I've seen her in the passing, but I've never been introduced to her. I've never shaken her hand. Maybe you have. But I know you hear of people when they have to go to the palace for honours. Maybe they've been given an OBE or whatever. And they afterwards speak about how it was a great honour for them. And they then are aware of the majesty of the moment. The Queen's just a little lady, but behind her she's got the power of the state. And when she bestows an honour on somebody, that is an awesome moment. And in that moment, they are aware of majesty. But too often in this life, it's something we know nothing about. And yet young people, they feel that about their pop idols. Before the lockdown, they would flock in their thousands to go and hear their pop idols. I'm not really into music, but remember, like the Beatles, thousands would flock to see them. And if they could just be alone with their pop idol, this sense of grandeur that came upon them, of majesty. People who like sport voyeurism, I call it. My friends, when I was young, used to love watching football. I just don't have that gene in me. I don't get the pleasure. I don't understand it. I remember, I think I told you this before, they took me to Hampden, which is a big football park in Glasgow, and Scotland was playing Northern Ireland, and George Best was playing for Northern Ireland. My friends took me, we went there, and they were screaming and shouting, jumping up and down for joy. Not when the Scots were kicking the ball, because they hardly kicked it, it was when George Best was winning. But I was bored. But they were loving it, even though they were Scots. I never got that gene. But if they could get George Best alone with themselves, I could see it in them. They wanted that sense of majesty. He who created all things, he who created this universe and this world full of life, he who created you, to be with him, to spend just a few moments a day contemplating the glory of his majesty. When you do that, when you obey his commandments and read the scriptures, then as John often testifies, you will be aware of his presence with you, and you then will begin to fear him, for to fear God is to know him. But it also is to do with his absolute power, or as it says in the scriptures, his eternal power. When you come face to face with power, there is something terrifying and fearful about it. I've spoken to you before about when I've been in the Navy, when I've encountered, I remember one time I was on a passboat going to join a ship in the Holy Loch in Scotland, just going beyond it. We went, no civilians could see us, but we went beyond it to the Coolport, it's called, and that's where the nuclear weapons are stored. And as we were going past in the passboat, there was a nuclear submarine there, and a Polaris missile was being lowered into the submarine. The civilians can never see that, but I saw it, and I'm standing on the deck of this passboat, and I was taken aback. And looking at that missile being loaded in, and knowing the firepower that missile has, and that one missile had far more firepower than all the bombs and weapons used in the Second World War. And I paused for a moment and I considered that. And it's awesome. It's incredible. A few years ago, Belinda and I were driving in Scotland down Loch Lomond. And there's a secret, well, it's not secret anymore, but I remember when it was built, there's a military road going from Faz Lane on one side right across to Loch Lomond, and the civilians can't go along that road, and it's purely for the transportation of the nuclear missiles. In Scotland there's a Special Forces unit that belongs to the Royal Marines called the Comanche Group, and their role is to protect the transportation of the nuclear missiles. And I said to Belinda, something's going on, because the police were stopping us and we had to pull into laybys. And all of it, and they tried to block what we could see. And I said to Belinda, there's something going on here. And what it was this huge, big green tanker. And I know what it was carrying. It was carrying a nuclear missile. And all of a sudden, it made us laugh, because there were all these Greenpeace women in their white uniforms rushing out, but the Special Forces units came and put them aside. But the sense of awe and wonder of the power of that missile, it affected me. And when we pause and we consider him who made all things, and he's the one who plans out your life and mine, and the moment when we die, it's when he decides it. And when we pause and consider that, that's awesome. There's a reverence that comes over us, and that's the fear of God. There's another aspect of God's personality or his being that produces this fear, and it's this. It's his absolute purity and holiness. When you meet someone who's really good, someone really innocent, and when do we ever meet that? There's something different about them. On a number of occasions, I've met strangers, and I knew right away that they were Christians, without them having to say anything. My spirit resonated with theirs. Have you ever experienced that? There's something dynamic and wonderful going on in a Christian's life. When we totally surrender to the Lord, when we obey his commandments, when we fear him, his Spirit comes upon us and is changing us. and there's nothing that we're doing about it, and He's sanctifying us, and He's making us pure so that on that great day we can be taken to be with Him forever. When we meet Him, the purity, the light of His purity is going to shock us, and our knees will knock then. But when we pause in this life and consider Him, consider how pure He is, it has an effect on us. In conclusion, for time is going, let me encourage you not to think like the world thinks, that this world is made for us. It isn't. The Bible is crystal clear about this. God created everything. We're told in the book of Revelations, in chapter 4, remember when the 24 elders, along with all the saints in glory, when they're worshipping God, the 24 elders fell down before Him who sits on the throne, and they cried out, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and power and honour. For Thou hast created all things, not for the great harmony of all things, not for human happiness. Thou hast created all things, and for Thy pleasure, and they were and are created for Thy pleasure, it says. God created this world, this universe, for one purpose, and that was for Him, for His pleasure. And in His pleasure, He's decided to call out of this world a people for Himself, whom He's chosen from before the foundation of the earth. So you and I have been called and chosen so that we can live and reign with Him forever. In conclusion, as I close, let me encourage you not to think like the rest of this world, but to pause in your life, spend time reading the Scriptures like Anne's doing. Read it all the way through. Pause and think about the majesty and the glory of God and how insignificant we are. This world doesn't revolve around you and me. It revolves around His will. And let us give Him all the glory. And as we do that, this fear of God will come upon us. And the benefits of it is this. The Bible is crystal clear. It says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. These scholars and these skeptics who say that God doesn't exist, they can have all the PhDs that Oxford and Cambridge can give, but they're not very wise. They're just mad for not believing in Him. When we fear Him, He gives us His wisdom, and it's beyond this world's understanding. And not only that, but when we fear Him, it says He gives us life eternal. When we come to know the Saviour, when we really come to know Him, when we obey Him, and when we pause and contemplate His glory, His majesty, His power, and His holiness, and when we read the Scriptures, the fear of God comes upon us. We're changed inside. And we have something that this world doesn't have. We have His peace and His joy that He gives upon us. It was lovely, that story about John's great-granddaughter. She's now asked Jesus to be a friend, and He'll always be a friend. And she will be different from everyone around her, because she'll have that joy and that peace. And she will, as she gets older, get to know Him more and more. May God have been something that's been said this morning. May He encourage you and I to fear Him and obey His commandments for His name's sake. Amen. Let's pray.